Welcome to Horrified Stories, where fear comes to life. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more spine-chilling tales. Let's start our today's story, A House Without Shadows. When Emily and her husband, Tom, first saw the house, it felt like the answer to all their problems. Nestled on the edge of a quiet, picturesque town called Grayfield, the two-story Victorian home stood proud among tall oaks, its faded white paint giving it a charming, rustic appeal. For months, they had been searching for a place to start over, a chance to escape the smog and chaos of the city. Tom's job as a freelance graphic designer allowed him to work from anywhere, and Emily, a former teacher, hoped the peaceful environment might finally help her recover from the miscarriage that had left her spiraling into depression. "This place is perfect," Tom had said, his voice filled with enthusiasm as they walked through the airy, high-ceiling rooms during the initial showing. Emily had nodded, though she couldn't quite shake the odd feeling that lingered in the back of her mind. The house was lovely, but something about it felt off. Still, the price was unbeatable, the town welcoming, and the prospect of a fresh start too tempting to resist. Within a month, they had packed their belongings and moved in. Emily first noticed it on their second night in the house. They were unpacking in the living room, surrounded by cardboard boxes and stacks of books. The evening sun cast a warm orange glow through the large bay windows, and Tom was fiddling with the fireplace, trying to get it to work. Emily sat on the floor, pulling books from a box and placing them on a nearby shelf. As she reached for another book, she frowned. Her hand hovered midair, her eyes fixed on the hardwood floor. There were no shadows. The golden light streaming in from the windows illuminated the room, but none of the objects in the room, furniture, boxes, even her own hand, cast a single shadow. She blinked, convinced she must be imagining it. She waved her hand in front of her face, the motion clear in the sunlight, yet the floor remained perfectly uniform. "Tom," she said, her voice trembling slightly. He turned, a smudge of soot on his cheek. "What's up? Do you notice anything strange?" she asked, gesturing around the room. Tom glanced around, frowning. "Strange how?" "The shadows," she said. "There aren't any." Tom's brow furrowed as he walked to the middle of the room and looked around. Then he shrugged. Weird lighting, maybe. These old houses have quirks." Emily nodded, trying to convince herself he was right. Still, the unease lingered. Over the next week, they settled into their new home. Tom threw himself into his work, setting up his office in the sunroom upstairs. Emily spent her days organizing the house, exploring the town, and baking, a hobby she had picked up during the more difficult days of her recovery. The house, however, continued to unsettle her. The lack of shadows wasn't confined to the living room, it was everywhere. At first, she tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the way the sunlight hit the windows, or maybe the artificial lights were too diffused. But the more she noticed it, the more she realized it wasn't natural. One evening, as she sat on the porch, watching the sun set behind the hills, she deliberately placed a glass of water on the railing in front of her. The sunlight hit it directly, but no shadow appeared. Her unease deepened. A week after moving in, Emily woke in the middle of the night to a strange sound. It was faint at first, a soft rustling, like leaves being blown across a wooden floor. She sat up in bed, straining to hear. Tom snored softly beside her, oblivious. The sound grew louder, closer, as if something was moving through the hallway outside their bedroom. Emily's heart pounded as she slipped out of bed and crept toward the door. She opened it slowly, peering into the dark corridor. The sound stopped. She flipped on the hallway light. The corridor was empty, the pale walls and hardwood floor bathed in soft, shadowless light. She stared for a long moment, waiting for something to happen, but all was silent. Finally, she returned to bed, her nerves on edge. Sleep did not come easily. The next day, Emily decided to ask around the town about the house. She visited the local bakery, a quaint little shop run by an elderly woman named Mrs. Carter. The shop smelled of freshly baked bread and cinnamon, and Emily found herself relaxing slightly as she ordered a loaf of sourdough. "You're the one who moved into the old Grayson place, aren't you?" Mrs. Carter asked as she wrapped the loaf in brown paper. "Yes, that's right," Emily said, forcing a smile. "It's a beautiful house." Mrs. Carter hesitated, her hands pausing mid-wrap. "It is, but it's been empty for a long time. Most people in town avoid it." Emily frowned. "Why?" The old woman glanced around, as if checking to make sure no one else was listening. "They say it's cursed. People who live there, well, they don't stay long." Emily's stomach tightened. What do you mean? Mrs. Carter leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. Strange things happen in that house. Shadows that don't fall where they should. Lights flickering even when the wiring's fine. And at night, sounds like someone walking through the halls. Emily forced a laugh, though her throat felt dry. I'm sure it's just old house noises, creaky floorboards and all that. Mrs. Carter's expression didn't change. Maybe. Just be careful, dear. That evening, Emily decided to confront her unease head-on. She had avoided the basement since they moved in, unnerved by its narrow staircase and the heavy door that always seemed to stick slightly. But if she was going to feel at home in the house, she couldn't let her fears control her. She grabbed a flashlight and made her way downstairs. The air grew cooler as she descended, the dimmed light from the staircase fading into near darkness. The basement smelled of damp earth and mildew, and the sound of her footsteps echoed unnaturally. At first glance, the basement appeared unremarkable: concrete walls, a workbench covered in cobwebs, and a few old cardboard boxes stacked in the corner. But as she swept the flashlight across the room, she frowned. See, there, in the far corner, was a door. It was small and wooden, its paint peeling with age. Emily had noticed it during their initial walkthrough, and something about it felt wrong. The flashlight beam seemed to dim as it touched the door, as if the light itself was reluctant to go near it. Her heart raced as she stepped closer, her breath shallow. The air around the door felt colder, almost oppressive. She reached out, her hand trembling, and touched the doorknob. It was ice cold. Before Emily could decide whether to open the door, she heard it again, rustling sound. This time, it was louder, closer, coming from directly behind her. She spun around, the flashlight beam sweeping the room, but there was nothing there. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving only the oppressive silence of the basement. Emily backed away from the door, her pulse pounding. She fled up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind her. She locked it for good measure, her hands trembling as she turned the key. That night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching her, and somewhere, deep in its shadowless halls, it was waiting. Emily couldn't stop thinking about the door in the basement. It haunted her dreams, appearing in every corner of her subconscious like a silent sentinel. She would wake up drenched in sweat, the faint rustling sound from the previous night replaying in her mind. Tom noticed her growing unease, but brushed it off as stress from the move. It's a big adjustment, he said one morning over coffee. New town, new house. It's normal to feel unsettled. Emily didn't tell him about the door or the strange absence of shadows. She was starting to doubt her own sanity, wondering if grief and exhaustion were playing tricks on her. But deep down, she knew they weren't. Later that week, a knock at the door startled Emily as she was arranging books in the study. She opened the door to find a man in his 60s standing on the porch. He wore a faded plaid jacket and a wide-brimmed hat, and his face was weathered, with eyes that seemed to hold much knowledge. "Mrs. Harper?" he asked, his voice gravelly. "Yes," Emily replied hesitantly. "Can I help you?" The man glanced past her, as though scanning the house. "Name's Alan Beckett. Used to own this place. Thought I'd stop by, see how you were settling in." Emily blinked, surprised. "Oh, well, we're doing fine, I suppose. Would you like to come in?" Beckett hesitated before stepping inside, his boots leaving faint marks on the polished floor. His gaze roamed the room, lingering on the walls and ceilings, as if he was searching for something. "You've noticed it, haven't you?" he said abruptly. Emily stiffened. "Noticed what?" Beckett turned to face her, his expression grim. "The shadows, or rather, the lack of them." Her stomach dropped. "What do you know about that?" Beckett sighed, removing his head and clutching it in his hands. "I don't know what this house is. I bought it 20 years ago, thinking it was just another old property. But it's not. This place, it's wrong. The shadows are just the start." Beckett sat at the kitchen table, sipping the tea Emily had nervously prepared. He told her about his time in the house, how it had started with small things of shadows, strange sounds at night, a constant feeling of being watched, but it had escalated. "I started seeing things," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "shapes in the corners of my eyes, movements that shouldn't have been there. And then there was the basement." Emily's pulse quickened. "What about the basement?" Beckett's hands trembled slightly as he set the teacup down. "There's something down there, behind that door. I don't know what it is, but it's ancient, and it's hungry." Her breath caught. "Did you open the door?" Beckett shook his head. "I wanted to. The pull was strong, but I knew better. I left the house instead." Sold it to the first buyer who'd take it, and I never looked back. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. Why are you here now? Beckett's gaze darkened. Because I've been dreaming about this place. About you. I think the house knows I tried to escape, and it's calling me back. That night, Emily's sleep was restless. Tom had gone to bed early, leaving her alone in the living room. Her thoughts consumed by Beckett's words, she stared at the fireplace, watching the flames flicker unnaturally without casting shadows on the walls. As the clock struck midnight, she heard it again rustling. It was louder this time, coming from directly beneath her feet. Emily's heart raced as she grabbed the flashlight from the coffee table and crept toward the basement door. She hesitated, her hand on the doorknob, before slowly unlocking it and stepping onto the staircase. The rustling grew louder as she descended, echoing in the confined space. The flashlight beam wavered as her hands trembled, the cold air biting at her skin. She reached the bottom of the stairs and frowned. The small wooden door was open. The space beyond it was pitch black, the darkness so thick it seemed to absorb the light from her flashlight. The rustling sound came from within, accompanied by a faint, wet squelching that made her stomach turn. "Hello," she called, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. For a moment, there was silence. Then, something moved in the darkness. Emily stumbled backward, tripping over a loose brick and landing hard on the floor. The flashlight rolled out of her hand, the beam flickering as it pointed toward the open door. She saw something emerge, a pale, thin hand with elongated fingers, stretching into the light. She scrambled to her feet, grabbed the flashlight, and bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind her. She locked it and pushed a heavy chair against it for good measure, her breath coming in ragged gasps. From the other side of the door, she heard a single knock. The next morning, Emily found Beckett waiting on the porch. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot, as if he hadn't slept. "It's getting stronger, isn't it?" he asked as soon as she opened the door. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Something came out of the basement last night." Beckett's jaw tightened. "Then we don't have much time." He pulled a worn leather-bound book from his satchel and handed it to her. The cover was embossed with strange symbols, and the pages were filled with handwritten notes and sketches. "This belonged to the man who lived here before me," Beckett explained. "He was obsessed with the house, trying to understand it. The notes say the house sits on a convergence and intersection of ley lines. Places like this, they act as doorways." Emily flipped through the pages, her stomach churning as she saw drawings of the basement door, surrounded by grotesque figures and symbols. "What's behind the door?" she asked, her voice shaking. Beckett hesitated. "Something old, something that shouldn't be here, and if it's waking up, we're all in danger." Beckett proposed a plan. They would seal the door, using rituals described in the book to block whatever was on the other side. Emily wanted to tell Tom, but Beckett insisted against it. "The house will target him," he said. "It knows you're the one it's marked. Bringing him into this will only make things worse." Reluctantly, Emily agreed. That night, while Tom slept upstairs, she and Beckett descended into the basement. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and the open door loomed ahead like a dark void. Beckett handed her a bundle of candles and chalk. "Draw the symbols exactly as they're shown in the book. I'll handle the incantation." Emily's hands shook as she worked, the symbols glowing faintly as she completed each one. Beckett began chanting in a low, guttural voice, the words foreign and unsettling. The rustling sound returned, louder than ever, accompanied by a deep, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the walls. The darkness beyond the door began to churn, shapes moving within it. "Hurry," Beckett shouted, his voice strained. Emily drew the final symbol, and Beckett slammed the door shut, pressing his hands against it as he finished the incantation. The growling stopped abruptly, leaving only silence. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, Beckett stepped back, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "It's done," he said. "For now." Emily nodded, her body trembling, but as they turned to leave, the faint sound of rustling returned at this time, coming from the walls. After sealing the door, Emily and Beckett returned to the ground floor, the weight of the basement's oppressive atmosphere still clinging to them. The ritual had worked for now, but Emily could sense that the house wasn't finished with her. As she locked the basement door again, she noticed something strange. Faint hairline cracks had appeared in the plaster of the hallway walls, snaking upward like veins. She ran her fingers over one, feeling a faint vibration, as if the house itself was alive. "Did you notice these cracks before?" she asked Beckett. He frowned, stepping closer to inspect them. "No, but this place." It doesn't obey normal rules. It's like the house is reacting, fighting back. Emily swallowed hard. What happens if it breaks free? Beckett's silence was answer enough. The following morning, Emily tried to act normal. She made breakfast for Tom, hoping he wouldn't notice the tension that radiated off her like a second skin. He seemed preoccupied anyway, scrolling through emails on his phone as he sipped his coffee. But later that afternoon, Tom came into the living room, holding the leather-bound book Beckett had given her. "What's this?" he asked, flipping through the pages. Emily's stomach dropped. "Where did you find that?" "It was on the kitchen counter," he said, raising an eyebrow. "What's all this? These symbols and notes. It's creepy." "It's just something left behind by the previous owner," she said quickly, reaching for the book. "I thought it was interesting." Tom held it out of her reach, his frown deepening. "Emily, is this about the weird stuff you've been saying? The shadows, the noises at night?" "I don't want to talk about it," she snapped, grabbing the book and clutching it to her chest. "Just drop it." "Tom," he held up his hands defensively. "Fine, but if something's bothering you, you need to tell me. This house site's been stressing you out since day one." Emily nodded, but she couldn't bring herself to say more. How could she explain that the house wasn't just stressful, it was alive, and it wanted her? That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, listening to Tom's steady breathing, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. The house was too quiet, its silence more unnerving than any noise. When she finally drifted off, she was plunged into a vivid, horrifying dream. She was back in the basement, standing in front of the small wooden door. It was open again, but instead of darkness, a faint, reddish light poured out. The walls pulsed like living flesh, and the air was thick with the metallic scent of blood. Something moved in the light, a figure, tall and impossibly thin, its body twisted and wrong. It had no face, only a blank expanse of skin where features should have been. As it stepped closer, he raised a hand and pointed at her. "You opened it," the figure rasped, its voice like dry leaves. "You let it in." Emily jolted awake, gasping for air. Sweat drenched her body, and her heart raced as though she'd been running. She looked around the room, half expecting to see the faceless figure standing in the corner. But there was nothing. Just the shadowless room and the suffocating stillness of the house. The next morning, Emily called Beckett, begging him to come back. When he arrived, he looked even more haggard than before, dark circles under his eyes and a slight tremor in his hands. "I had a dream," Emily said as they Saturday in the living room. "There was something in the basement. It told me I let it in." Beckett's expression darkened. "Dreams are how it communicates. It wants to wear you down, make you doubt yourself. The more you interact with the house, the more power it has over you." Emily's hands clenched into fists. "Then how do we stop it? We sealed the door, didn't we?" Beckett hesitated before pulling out a folded piece of paper from his pocket. He unfolded it to reveal a crude map of the house, with several symbols marked in different rooms. "This isn't just about the door," he said. "The entire house is a conduit. There are focal points, places where the energy is strongest. If we can disrupt them, we might weaken its hold." Emily's stomach churned as she studied the map. "And what if it doesn't work?" Beckett didn't answer. The first focal point was the attic. Emily had avoided going up there since they moved in. It felt wrong, like stepping into a space that wasn't meant for her. But now, armed with the book and Beckett's guidance, she and Beckett climbed the narrow staircase, the air growing colder with each step. The attic was cluttered with old furniture, dusty boxes, and broken lamps, but in the center of the room, the floorboards were bare, revealing a strange symbol carved into the wood. It looked ancient, the lines jagged and uneven, as though it had been scratched into the floor by something with claws. Beckett lit a bundle of sage and began chanting under his breath. Emily knelt beside the symbol, using a piece of chalk to draw over it, following the instructions from the book. As she worked, the temperature in the attic dropped further, her breath forming white puffs in the air. The rustling sound returned, louder than ever, accompanied by a deep, guttural growl. Emily glanced over her shoulder and frowned. In the corner of the attic, a shadowy figure loomed. It had no distinct features, just a mass of shifting darkness that seemed to pulse with malevolence. "Keep going," Beckett shouted, his voice strained. Emily forced herself to focus, her hands trembling as she completed the chalk lines. The symbol glowed faintly, and the figure let out an ear-piercing screech before dissolving into nothingness. The air grew still, and the temperature returned to normal. "One down," Beckett said, his voice shaky. "Free to go." That night, the house retaliated. Emily and Tom were eating dinner when the lights flickered. At first, it seemed like a power surge. But then the entire house was plunged into darkness. Tom cursed, reaching for his phone to use as a flashlight. "Let me check the breaker," he said, getting up from the table. "No," Emily said, grabbing his arm. Her voice was sharper than she intended, and Tom frowned at her. "What's going on with you?" he asked. "You've been acting so weird lately. Is there something you're not telling me?" Emily opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the rustling sound filled the room. It was deafening now, coming from every direction. The walls seemed to vibrate with the noise, and a low, menacing growl emanated from the shadows. "Tom, we need to leave," Emily said, her voice trembling. "What the hell is that?" he asked, looking around. Before she could answer, the dining room window shattered, shards of glass raining down on the table. A strong gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the candles Emily had lit. In the darkness, she could see shapes, moving, twisting, unnatural forms that seemed to slither across the walls. "Get to the car," Beckett shouted, appearing in the doorway with a flashlight. Tom looked at him in confusion, but Emily grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the front door. The three of them fled into the night, the house seeming to groan behind them as if it were alive. Once they were outside, Beckett turned to Tom, his expression grim. "You need to take Emily and leave this place tonight." Tom looked between them, his face a mixture of fear and anger. "What the hell is going on? What aren't you telling me?" Emily hesitated, tears streaming down her face. "The house, it's not normal. There's something wrong with it. Tom, something evil." Tom stared at her, his jaw tightening. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't want to scare you," she said. "I thought I could handle it, but it's too much. It's not safe here." Beckett placed a hand on Tom's shoulder. "Take her somewhere far away. Don't come back." Tom nodded, though his face was pale. "What about you?" Beckett's expression hardened. "I have to finish what I started." Tom was furious, but scared enough to agree to leave. Emily packed quickly, tossing clothes into a suitcase while her hands trembled. She had spent weeks ignoring the escalating dread, thinking she could manage it, but it was clear now that the house was far beyond her control. Beckett, however, refused to come. "I've been running from this place for years," he said, his face pale but resolute. "This time, I'm ending it." "You don't have to do this alone," Emily said, her voice shaking as she shoved the last of her belongings into a bag. "Yes, I do," Beckett replied firmly. "Whatever's in that house is tied to me. You need to leave now, before it tries to pull you back in." Tom honked the car horn outside, but Emily hesitated. She didn't want to abandon Beckett, not when she knew what the house was capable of. "Go," Beckett urged. "I'll buy you time." Tears blurred her vision as she nodded. "Be careful." Without another word, Emily ran to the car, where Tom waited with the engine running. As they pulled away, she glanced back at the house. It loomed in the distance, dark and silent, yet alive with a malevolence that seemed to follow them down the road. The first few miles were uneventful. The countryside stretched out in darkness, broken only by the faint glow of the moon. Tom gripped the steering wheel tightly, his jaw set. "You're going to tell me everything," he said, breaking the tense silence. "I will," Emily whispered, "once we're safe." But before she could say more, the car's headlights flickered, the dashboard lights dimmed, and the engine sputtered. "No," Tom muttered, pressing the gas pedal harder. The car slowed, then came to a complete stop in the middle of the empty road. "What's happening?" Emily asked, her voice rising in panic. Tom tried turning the key, but the engine wouldn't start. The headlights flickered one last time before plunging them into darkness. And then they heard it, the rustling sound, growing louder, as though something was moving through the trees on either side of the road. "It followed us," Emily whispered, her breath hitching. Tom grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out of the car. "Stay here." "No," Emily said, reaching for him. "Don't go out there." But it was too late. Tom was already walking toward the front of the car, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The rustling grew louder, closer, and then, from the corner of her eye, Emily saw it something pale and thin moving in the shadows beyond the tree line. "Tom, get back in the car," she screamed. He turned just as the figure emerged from the woods. It was tall, impossibly thin, and its blank, featureless face seemed to tilt toward him as if studying him. Tom frowned, the flashlight slipping from his hand. "Tom!" Emily screamed again, fumbling with the car door handle, but before she could reach him, the figure stepped closer, raising one long, spindly arm. And then it was gone. One moment, it was standing in front of Tom. The next, it dissolved into the darkness, leaving nothing but silence. Tom stumbled back to the car, his face pale and drenched in sweat. Drive, he said hoarsely. We have to get as far away as possible. Meanwhile, back at the house, Beckett prepared for the final confrontation. The ritual he and Emily had performed in the attic had weakened the house. But it wasn't enough. He knew that to truly destroy the evil that resided there, he would have to go back to the basement, back to the door. The house seemed to sense his intent. As he walked through the hallways, the air grew heavy, and the walls creaked ominously. The faint cracks Emily had noticed earlier were now jagged fissures, pulsating like veins beneath flesh. When he reached the basement door, Beckett hesitated. His hand trembled as he gripped the doorknob, and for a moment, he considered walking away. But then he remembered the dreams, the years of torment, the lives the house had already claimed. He couldn't run anymore. Beckett opened the door and descended into the basement, the flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. The small wooden door at the back of the room was ajar, a faint reddish light spilling out from within. As he stepped closer, the rustling sound surrounded him, accompanied by a low, guttural growl. The darkness beyond the door churned, and shapes began to emerge, twisted, grotesque figures with glowing red eyes. Beckett raised the book, his voice steady as he began to chant. Miles away, Emily felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to turn back. "We can't leave him," she said, her voice trembling. "Are you insane?" Tom shouted. "That thing followed us. We barely got away." "I can't just abandon him," Emily said, tears streaming down her face. "He's trying to stop it, and if he fails..." Tom stared at her, his expression torn. Finally, he cursed under his breath and slammed his foot on the gas, turning the car around. They sped back toward the house, the oppressive feeling growing stronger as they approached. When they arrived, the house seemed to radiate darkness, its windows glowing faintly red. Emily and Tom ran inside, the walls vibrating with the sound of Beckett's chanting. "He's in the basement," Emily shouted, leading the way. In the basement, Beckett's chanting grew louder as the figures from the darkness pressed closer. He could feel the house fighting back, its malevolence seeping into his mind, whispering promises of release if he would only stop. But it didn't stop. The symbols he had drawn earlier began to glow, and the figures recoiled, their forms dissolving into mist. Emily and Tom burst into the basement just as the door began to tremble. The reddish light flared brighter, and a deafening roar filled the room. "We're here to help," Emily shouted, grabbing Beckett's arm. "No," he yelled. "You have to get out. If it takes you, it's over." But Emily didn't move. Together, she and Beckett continued the chant, their voices merging as the house seemed to ride around them. The door burst open, revealing an endless void filled with swirling, pulsating shadows. A massive, clawed hand reached out, grasping for them. "Finish it!" Beckett screamed, shoving Emily and Tom toward the stairs. As Emily and Tom fled, Beckett stayed behind. He held the book high, his voice unwavering as he recited the final words of the ritual. The hand reached for him, but Beckett didn't flinch. The symbols on the walls glowed brighter, and the void began to collapse in on itself. With a final, earth-splitting roar, the hand and the door were pulled into the void, and the basement was plunged into silence. Emily and Tom stood outside the house, watching as the cracks spread across its facade. The building groaned, shuddered, and finally collapsed inward, leaving nothing but a smoldering ruin. Beckett was gone, but his sacrifice had saved them. As they drove away, Emily glanced in the rearview mirror. For the first time, the shadows cast by the rising sun seemed normal. But deep in her heart, she knew the house's evil wasn't truly gone. Some doors can never be fully closed. If you like this story, don't forget to hit the like button, share and subscribe the channel. Help us grow. Thanks for watching.